Marcus Devlin's blood turned to ice as two golden eyes gleamed at him from the darkness of the kitchen he'd just broken into. The 30 pounds of wild fury launching toward his chest was the last thing he'd expected to find in an elderly woman's home. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Pinecrest had never seen anything quite like it. As moonlight spilled across manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges, Marcus Devlin worked his way around the back of Eleanor Whitaker's modest bungalow, his practiced fingers testing windows and doors with silent precision. The 78-year-old widow living alone made for what he considered a perfect target. No security system, no dogs, and certainly no real threat to a man of his size and experience. What Marcus didn't know, couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that behind that unassuming wooden door with its simple brass lock waited 30 pounds of wild instinct and unforgiving claws. A silent guardian with golden eyes that pierced the darkness, watching his every move. Tonight the hunter would become the hunted, and Marcus Devlin was about to learn a lesson in natural justice he would never forget. Eleanor Whitaker had never considered herself extraordinary. At 78, her life had followed the predictable rhythm of small-town America. Marriage to her high school sweetheart Frank, raising two children who'd long since moved to opposite coasts, and eventually settling into the quiet routines of widowhood. Her modest home on Maple Street housed a lifetime of memories, from black and white wedding photos to her late husband's collection of antique fishing lures. Nothing about Eleanor suggested she'd be anything but an easy mark for someone like Marcus Devlin, a fact he'd confirmed after 3 days of careful observation. What Marcus had failed to notice during his surveillance was the peculiar arrangement Eleanor had with the local wildlife rehabilitation center. 2 months earlier, Eleanor had received an unexpected visitor that would change her life forever. Dr. James Harrington, her nephew and director of the Mountain Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, had arrived at her doorstep with an unusual request and an even more unusual companion. "Aunt Ellie, I wouldn't ask if we had any other options," James had explained, setting down a large metal carrier on her kitchen floor. From inside came a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on Eleanor's arms stand up. "The center's at capacity with the spring rescue season, and we've got renovations happening in the Predator wing. We just need somewhere quiet for Moxie to stay for a few weeks while she recovers." Eleanor peered cautiously at the carrier, where two luminous golden eyes stared back at her from the shadows. "James, dear, is that what I think it is?" James nodded, his expression somewhere between apologetic and hopeful. "She's a 4-year-old female bobcat. Someone illegally kept her as a pet, then abandoned her when she grew too large to handle. She's been at the center for rehabilitation, but she developed an infection after her spay surgery, and she needs a quiet place to recover before we can release her." Eleanor's eyes had widened. "And you thought of me?" "James, I know nothing about wild animals." "That's actually perfect," James had replied, setting down a thick binder of instructions on her kitchen table. "We don't want her getting too comfortable around humans. She just needs a quiet space where she can heal without the stress of the center. The sunroom at the back of your house would be ideal. It's secure, has access to fresh air, and you can just leave food and water without much interaction." Eleanor had always found it impossible to say no to her nephew, the spitting image of her late brother. Besides, after 53 years of marriage and 6 years of widowhood, the prospect of something unpredictable happening in her life held a certain appeal. "How long are we talking about?" she'd asked, already mentally rearranging her sunroom. 4 weeks, maybe 6 at the most. She's already on the mend, but these things take time." James had squeezed her hand gratefully. "You'll hardly know she's there, I promise." That had been the first of many well-intentioned untruths about living with Moxie the bobcat. Far from being an invisible house guest, The recuperating feline had quickly established herself as a dominant presence in Eleanor's home. The sunroom had proven inadequate within days, as Moxie demonstrated an uncanny ability to open the sliding door into the kitchen. Rather than fight a losing battle, Eleanor had simply adapted, learning to coexist with a semi-wild predator who treated her furniture as climbing equipment and developed a peculiar fascination with Eleanor's collection of ceramic figurines. Against all protocols and James's explicit instructions, Moxie and Eleanor had formed an unlikely bond. The Bobcat maintained her distance during the day, often lounging in the rafters of the sunroom or hidden away in the spare bedroom, but as evening fell, she would silently pad into the living room, settling on the opposite end of the sofa while Eleanor watched her game shows. There was an understanding between them, a mutual respect for each other's space and peculiarities. 6 weeks turned into 8, and then 12, Eleanor would later explain to the astonished police officers. James kept finding reasons to delay moving her to the release site. First, her blood work wasn't quite right. Then they spotted hunters near the planned release area. Then it was concerns about her hunting skills being rusty. I stopped asking after a while. Truth be told, I'd grown rather fond of her company. By the 3rd month of their cohabitation, they had settled into comfortable routines. Moxie had free run of the house except during Eleanor's weekly bridge club meetings, when she was secured in the sunroom with enough enrichment toys to keep her occupied. The Bobcat had proven herself to be surprisingly clean, fastidious even, using a modified litter box in the utility room and never damaging anything of real value. She ate a carefully prepared diet of raw meat and specialized supplements that James delivered weekly, though Eleanor suspected Moxie also helped herself to the occasional backyard squirrel when the sliding door was left open. The arrangement remained their secret, known only to James and 2 trusted staff members at the rehabilitation center. Eleanor's neighbors believed she was pet-sitting her nephew's Maine Coon cat, a fiction supported by carefully drawn curtains and Moxie's remarkably discreet nature. Even Eleanor's own children remained unaware that their mother was sharing her home with an apex predator. "She's good company," Eleanor had told James during his last visit, 3 days before Marcus Devlin would make the worst decision of his life. "Doesn't talk back, doesn't ask me if I'm taking my medications, and she's better security than any alarm system money can buy." James had looked concerned, making notes about Moxie's weight and behavior. "Aunt Ellie, you know this can't be permanent. She's a wild animal, not a pet. The goal has always been to release her." Eleanor had nodded, avoiding her nephew's gaze as she refilled her teacup. "Of course, dear. Whenever you think she's ready." Neither of them acknowledged the obvious, that Moxie's chance for true rehabilitation diminished with each passing week in human company. For now, the fiction of eventual release remained intact, allowing both human and Bobcat to continue their improbable coexistence. On that fateful Tuesday night in May, Eleanor had gone to bed early, leaving Moxie sprawled across the kitchen table in a patch of moonlight. The Bobcat's exceptional hearing had registered the faint scratching at the back door hours later, her muscular body instantly alert, ears pivoting toward the sound of metal tools working against the lock. With the silent efficiency of a natural predator, Moxie had slipped from the table and positioned herself in the shadows, watching as the door slowly eased open and a dark figure slipped inside. Marcus Devlin had done his homework. 3 nights of surveillance had yielded a detailed mental map of Eleanor Whitaker's habits. Lights out by 9:30 p.m., no visitors except Sundays when her nephew stopped by, no security system beyond a standard door lock, and most importantly, no dog. The soft click of the back door yielding to his pick set was music to his ears, confirming everything he'd anticipated about this job: quick, quiet, and uncomplicated. He paused in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The kitchen was tidy, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through lace curtains and the soft blue glow of a digital clock on the microwave. His practiced gaze immediately cataloged items of potential value. A silver tea service on the counter, what appeared to be antique china, visible through glass-fronted cabinets. Not his usual targets, but the local fence had specifically requested old lady valuables, silver, china, jewelry, things that could be easily transported and sold to collectors with few questions asked. Marcus closed the door behind him with practiced care, wincing slightly at the faint squeak of hinges. He stood motionless, listening for any sound that might indicate he'd disturbed the elderly homeowner. Nothing. Just the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of what he assumed was a grandfather clock in another room. Perfect. He reached into his pocket for his pen light, preparing to begin his systematic search of the house when instinct made him freeze. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, that primordial warning system that had kept humans alive since they lived in caves. Someone, or something, was watching him. Slowly, Marcus turned his head toward the kitchen table. Two golden eyes reflected his penlight beam back at him, floating in the darkness like twin harvest moons. His brain, conditioned to expect a house cat at most, took a moment to process what his eyes were seeing. This was no ordinary tabby. The creature perched on the edge of the kitchen table was far too large, its muscular shoulders and distinctive tufted ears unmistakable even in the dim light. "What the fuck?" he whispered, the words escaping involuntarily as his mind raced to make sense of the situation. A bobcat. There was a goddamn bobcat in this old woman's kitchen. Moxie studied the intruder with calculating precision. 3 months of living with Eleanor had somewhat dulled her natural wariness of humans, but this man was different. He smelled wrong, moved wrong, and most importantly, he didn't belong. The bobcat's muscles tensed, her powerful hind legs coiling beneath her as she maintained perfect stillness, assessing the threat with predatory patience. Marcus took a tentative step backward toward the door, his survival instincts finally overriding his criminal intentions. The bobcat's eyes tracked his movement, unwavering and unblinking. Another step back, his hand fumbling behind him for the doorknob. The bobcat's ears flattened against her skull, a warning sign Marcus was unfortunately unfamiliar with. His fingers had just closed around the cool metal of the doorknob when light suddenly flooded the kitchen, momentarily blinding both man and beast. "Who's there? Who's—" Eleanor Whitaker stood in the doorway to the hallway, one hand on the light switch, the other clutching her ancient rotary phone. "I've called the police," she bluffed, having done no such thing. She'd been awakened by an unfamiliar sound and had come to investigate, expecting perhaps to find Moxie had knocked something over. The sight that greeted her, a masked man in her kitchen, sent her heart racing dangerously. For a fraction of a second, the tableau held, Eleanor in her faded blue nightgown and cardigan, frozen in shock. Marcus, dressed entirely in black with a ski mask covering his features, caught between the bobcat and the old woman, and Moxie, still as stone on the table edge, golden eyes now dilated in the sudden brightness. Then several things happened almost simultaneously. Marcus, startled by Eleanor's appearance, lurched forward reflexively, abandoning his retreat. Eleanor, seeing his movement toward her, stumbled backward with a frightened gasp, dropping the phone with a clatter. And Moxie, interpreting the man's sudden movement as aggression toward her elderly companion, launched herself from the table with explosive force. 30 pounds of muscle, claw, and primal fury collided with Marcus's chest, sending him staggering backward against the refrigerator. He threw his arms up instinctively, a motion that likely saved his eyes but left his forearms exposed to Moxie's first slashing attack. His scream of pain and shock was almost drowned out by the bobcat's snarling, a sound unlike anything Eleanor had heard in her 3 months with Moxie, a prehistoric vocalization that spoke of mountains and wilderness and the ancient covenant between predator and prey. "Moxie, no!" Eleanor cried out, more from shock than any real expectation of obedience. To her astonishment, the Bobcat checked her attack momentarily, golden eyes flicking toward Eleanor before returning to the intruder. That brief hesitation allowed Marcus to shove the animal off him and scramble sideways, putting the kitchen island between himself and the bristling predator. Blood seeped through the torn sleeve of his black sweater, where Moxie's claws had found purchase. "Call it off!" he shouted at Eleanor, his voice cracking with panic. "Jesus Christ, lady, call off your fucking cat!" Eleanor stood frozen, hand pressed to her mouth in horror. I can't," she admitted. "She's not a pet." Moxie circled the kitchen island, her movements fluid and purposeful, keeping herself between Eleanor and the intruder. The Bobcat's tail swished in agitation, her powerful shoulders rolling as she tracked Marcus's every movement. Gone was the relatively docile creature who lounged in sunbeams and tolerated Eleanor's gentle strokes along her back. This was a wild predator in her full power, defending her territory with single-minded determination. Marcus backed up against the sink, eyes darting frantically between the advancing Bobcat and the elderly woman. "Please," he begged, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of Moxie's unrelenting stare. "I'll go. I won't come back. Just don't let it attack me again." Eleanor's initial terror had begun to subside, replaced by an odd sense of calm. The situation was surreal, certainly, but the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically in her favor that she found herself straightening up, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't accessed in years. "You're bleeding on my kitchen floor," she observed with remarkable steadiness. "That's Moxie. She's a Bobcat, not an it. And whether she attacks you again is entirely up to her, I'm afraid. I have precious little control over what she decides to do." As if understanding the conversation, Moxie crouched lower, her rumbling growl vibrating through the kitchen. Marcus pressed himself harder against the counter, eyes wide with terror behind his mask. "What kind of crazy person keeps a Bobcat in their house?" he demanded, his voice pitched higher with fear. "The kind you shouldn't have robbed," Eleanor replied with surprising equanimity. She cautiously moved to the side of the room, careful not to make any sudden movements that might trigger Moxie into another attack. "Now I suggest you stay perfectly still while I actually do call the police." Marcus's eyes narrowed behind his mask. Even in his terror, the criminal part of his brain was calculating. If the old woman moved to the phone, perhaps he could make a break for the door. The Bobcat couldn't possibly be faster than him, could it? As if reading his thoughts, Moxie shifted her weight, muscles bunching visibly beneath her spotted coat. The message was clear. "Try it. I dare you." "Don't even think about it, young man," Eleanor warned, seeing the calculation in his posture. "Moxie can hit 30 miles per hour in a sprint. You'll never make the door." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, if not for the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the kitchen windows. All three occupants of the kitchen tensed at the unexpected development. "That'll be James," Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. "My nephew. He sometimes checks on me when he works the night shift at the wildlife center." Marcus's shoulders slumped in defeat. Trapped between a Bobcat and approaching reinforcements, his options had dwindled to zero. Blood continued to seep from the gashes on his forearms, and his initial adrenaline was giving way to the stinging pain of his wounds. The sound of a key in the front door lock was followed by a cheerful call. "Aunt Ellie, you up? I saw your kitchen light on." James Harrington stepped into the house, still dressed in his wildlife center uniform, carrying a cooler that presumably contained Moxie's weekly food supply. "I brought Moxie's." He stopped dead in the doorway to the kitchen, taking in the extraordinary scene, his elderly aunt in her nightclothes, a masked man bleeding and cornered against the sink, and Moxie in full predator mode between them. "What the hell?" James managed, setting down the cooler carefully. "James, dear," Eleanor said with remarkable composure, "we seem to have had a break-in." Moxie's handling it, but perhaps you could call the actual police now. James Harrington had spent 15 years working with predators at the Mountain Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. He'd treated injured mountain lions, rehabilitated orphaned wolf pups, and once spent 6 weeks hand-feeding a severely malnourished black bear cub. He had the scars and stories to prove it. But nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for finding his elderly aunt in a Mexican standoff with an armed robber and a partially domesticated bobcat in her kitchen at 2:30 in the morning. To his credit, James didn't panic. His years of wildlife crisis management kicked in, allowing him to assess the situation with clinical detachment. First priority, ensure Aunt Ellie's safety. Second, prevent Moxie from doing something that would result in her euthanasia. Third, deal with the bleeding criminal currently trapped against his aunt's sink. "Aunt Ellie, are you hurt?" James asked, his voice deliberately calm as he slowly entered the kitchen, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. "Not at all, dear," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. "Moxie saw to that." James nodded, glancing at the bobcat who remained fixed in her protective stance, muscles tense and ready to spring. Her attention remained locked on Marcus, tracking his every small movement with predatory focus. "I'm going to call the police now," James announced, making the statement loud enough for everyone to hear as he slowly reached for his cell phone. He maintained eye contact with the intruder as he dialed. "I suggest you don't move. She's already agitated, and sudden movements will just make things worse." Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, his eyes never leaving the bobcat. Blood had begun to pool on the floor beneath his arm, the gashes deeper than they'd initially appeared. "911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice sounded tinny through the phone speaker. "This is James Harrington. I'm at my aunt's house, 1473 Maple Street. There's been a break-in. The intruder is still here, injured but contained. We need police assistance." James kept his explanation brief and factual, deliberately omitting mention of Moxie. That complication could wait until the authorities arrived. "Is anyone else injured? Do you need medical assistance?" James glanced at Eleanor, who shook her head slightly. "No, my aunt is unharmed. The intruder has some lacerations, but nothing life-threatening. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line until they arrive." "Thank you." James kept the phone to his ear, but turned his attention back to the scene before him. "They're on their way," he informed the room at large. Eleanor had settled into one of the kitchen chairs, her initial adrenaline rush beginning to ebb. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her cardigan. "Would anyone like some tea while we wait?" she asked, as if this were nothing more extraordinary than an unexpected social call. James couldn't help but smile despite the tension. His aunt's generation had been taught that hospitality was appropriate in any circumstance. "I think we're fine, Aunt Ellie." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Are you insane, lady? Your demon cat just tried to kill me, and you're offering tea?" Moxie growled at the sound of his raised voice, causing Marcus to press himself harder against the sink. "There's no need to be rude," Eleanor sniffed disapprovingly. "And Moxie isn't a demon. She's a North American bobcat, Lynx rufus, if you want to be scientific about it. She was simply protecting her home, which is more than can be said for what you were doing here." The absurdity of being lectured on proper behavior by the elderly woman he'd intended to rob wasn't lost on Marcus. A hysterical laugh bubbled up from his chest, quickly stifled when Moxie responded with a warning snarl. "I suggest you stay quiet," James advised, noticing how the bobcat's ears flattened at the sound of the intruder's voice. "Moxie associates this place with safety and Aunt Ellie with security. You're an intruder in her territory, and she's still deciding whether you need a more permanent removal." Marcus swallowed hard and nodded, keeping his eyes on the predator crouched just 10 feet away. The kitchen fell into tense silence, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. The arrival of the police created a new set of complications. 2 officers responded initially: Officer Sandra Walton, a veteran with 20 years on the force, and Officer Keith Jensen, a rookie just 8 months out of the academy. They approached the house with standard caution for a reported break-in, unaware of the exotic complication awaiting them inside. James met them at the front door, quickly explaining the situation before they entered. "My aunt is fine. The intruder is contained, but there's something else you should know before you go in there." Officer Walton raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" "My aunt has been temporarily housing a rehabilitation bobcat. She's the one who stopped the intruder." The officers exchanged glances. "A pet bobcat?" Officer Jensen asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "Not a pet," James corrected firmly. "A wild animal in rehabilitation. I'm the director of Mountain Ridge Wildlife Center. The bobcat Moxie has been recovering from surgery. She's not aggressive under normal circumstances, but she protected my aunt when this man broke in." Officer Walton's expression made it clear she was mentally reviewing protocols that almost certainly didn't cover this situation. "Is the animal contained now?" "She's in the kitchen, still watching the intruder. She's calm as long as he doesn't make sudden movements." After a quick radio consultation with their sergeant, the officers cautiously entered the house. The scene in the kitchen remained largely unchanged. Eleanor still seated at the table, Marcus still pressed against the sink, Moxie still in her vigilant crouch between them. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Officer Walton asked, keeping her distance from the bobcat. "Perfectly fine, officer. Thank you for asking," Eleanor replied. "Though I would appreciate if someone could clean up the blood soon. It can't be good for my linoleum." Officer Jensen stared at Moxie with undisguised fascination. "I've never seen a bobcat this close before." "Few people have, dear, and live to tell about it," Eleanor said with unexpected humor. "Moxie is exceptional in many ways." The officers proceeded with admirable professionalism, calling in animal control as a precaution while they dealt with Marcus. With James's expert guidance, they managed to secure the burglar without further incident. Moxie, seeming to sense that the threat was contained, had relaxed slightly but maintained her watchful position. Marcus Devlin, it turned out, was well known to local law enforcement. 3 prior convictions for breaking and entering, currently on parole and now facing new charges that would send him back to prison for a significant stretch. As Officer Walton handcuffed him and read him his rights, he couldn't stop glancing nervously at Moxie. "You need to document these wounds," he insisted as Officer Jensen examined the deep gashes on his forearms. "That thing is dangerous. It should be put down." "Sir, from what I understand, you illegally entered this home with intent to commit a crime," Officer Walton replied evenly. "The fact that the homeowner happens to have a wildlife rehabilitation animal on the premises who protected her is actually not relevant to your charges. You'd be in the same legal position if it had been a dog." "A dog? That's not a dog. It's a wild animal." Eleanor spoke up from her place at the table. "Moxie has all her proper permits and documentation. She's here legally as part of a supervised rehabilitation program. You, on the other hand..." She let the sentence trail off meaningfully, earning a smile from Officer Walton. By the time animal control arrived, the situation had evolved considerably. The county's only wildlife specialist, Dr. Ramona Diaz, assessed Moxie from a respectful distance. "She's remarkably calm considering the circumstances," Dr. Diaz observed. "Most bobcats would be climbing the walls with this many people in the room." "Moxie's special," James explained, watching as the bobcat had finally settled into a seated position, though her attention remained fixed on the kitchen doorway, where Marcus had been escorted out. "She was imprinted on humans as a kitten before we got her at the center. That's why she can't be fully released back into the wild. She's too comfortable around people. Which turned out to be rather fortunate for me tonight, Eleanor added. As the night progressed into early morning, Eleanor's kitchen became command central for an increasingly complicated operation. Additional officers arrived to process the break-in. An evidence technician photographed the scene. Paramedics treated Marcus's wounds before he was transported to the hospital under police supervision. Through it all, Moxie remained surprisingly composed, eventually retreating to her favorite spot on top of the refrigerator, watching the proceedings with regal detachment. By dawn, the house had finally emptied of everyone except Eleanor, James, and Moxie. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking remarkably unruffled for someone who had just experienced such an ordeal. "You should try to get some rest, Aunt Ellie," James suggested gently. "It's been quite a night." Eleanor took a sip of her tea, her eyes drifting to where Moxie was now grooming herself on the windowsill, sunlight illuminating her spotted coat. "You know, James, when you first brought Moxie here, I thought you were absolutely mad. A bobcat in my house, at my age." James smiled. "I remember. You called me every day that first week, convinced she was plotting to eat you in your sleep." "Well, it turns out she was plotting something, but not against me." Eleanor's expression softened as she watched the bobcat. "She was protecting her home, protecting me." News of the break-in spread through Pinecrest with the speed and efficiency that only small-town gossip networks can achieve. By lunchtime, the basic facts had evolved into a tapestry of increasingly elaborate narratives, each retelling adding new embellishments. Eleanor Whitaker, previously known primarily for her prize-winning zucchini bread at the county fair and her volunteer work at the community library, had suddenly become a local celebrity. The first reporter arrived at Eleanor's front door shortly before noon. A eager young woman from the Pinecrest Gazette, armed with a notebook and an expression that suggested this might be her ticket to a larger market. Eleanor, who had managed a few hours of fitful sleep, answered the door in her everyday attire of pressed slacks and a cardigan, her silver hair neatly pinned back. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Allison Chen from the Gazette. We received reports about an unusual incident at your home last night involving a break-in and a wild animal." The reporter's eyes darted past Eleanor as if expecting to see a bobcat lounging on the living room sofa. Eleanor regarded the young woman with the same expression she'd once used on kindergartners during her 40 years as a school librarian. Patient, but not to be trifled with. "Yes, there was an incident. No, I'm not giving interviews at this time. And Moxie is resting, as should be expected after such excitement." Despite Eleanor's firm stance, by evening the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By the following morning, a van from the nearest network affiliate had parked across the street, and Eleanor's phone rang with such persistence that she eventually unplugged it. James arrived shortly after breakfast, looking harried. "Aunt Ellie, we need to talk about Moxie." Eleanor was in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be a gourmet meal for a bobcat, a carefully arranged plate of raw chicken thighs and rabbit meat, with a sprinkling of the vitamin supplements James had provided. Moxie watched from her perch atop the refrigerator, whiskers twitching with interest. "What about her?" Eleanor asked, her tone suggesting she already knew what was coming. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Eleanor recognized as a precursor to uncomfortable conversations. "The center's board has called an emergency meeting. There are concerns about liability, about precedent, about keeping a bobcat that has now demonstrated aggression toward a human, regardless of the circumstances." Eleanor set down the plate with deliberate care. "I see. And what are they proposing to do with her?" "Best case scenario, transfer to a permanent wildlife sanctuary. Worst case..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Euthanasia," Eleanor completed flatly. "For protecting me. for doing exactly what any loyal dog would have done. She's not a dog, Aunt Ellie. That's the point. She's a wild predator, and now there's documented evidence of her attacking a person. A criminal who broke into her home in the middle of the night, Eleanor countered, her voice rising. Moxie's ears swiveled toward her, sensing the change in tone. And need I remind you that she stopped when I called her name? She showed more restraint than most humans would in similar circumstances. James sighed, leaning against the counter. I know, and I'm on your side here. I've already argued that this was defensive behavior in an extreme situation, not random aggression, but the board is concerned about public perception, about legal implications. The center operates on grants and donations. They can't afford a scandal. Eleanor's expression hardened into something James hadn't seen since childhood, when he'd been caught drawing in the margins of library books. Then perhaps public perception is exactly what they should be worried about. How do you think people will react when they learn that a bobcat who heroically protected an elderly woman from a violent criminal is being punished for it? James winced. Aunt Ellie, please don't turn this into a media circus. I'm 78 years old, James. I've spent my entire life being reasonable, following rules, doing what's expected, but I will not stand by while Moxie is condemned for doing what nature designed her to do, protect her territory, and by extension, me. As if understanding the gravity of the conversation, Moxie leapt gracefully from the refrigerator to the counter, then to the floor, where she pressed herself against Eleanor's legs in an unusually demonstrative gesture. Eleanor reached down to stroke the bobcat's head, receiving a rumbling purr in response. Look at her, James. Really look at her. Is this the dangerous predator your board is so concerned about? James watched the interaction with professional interest. In his 15 years of wildlife work, he'd never seen a bobcat display such comfort with human contact. Moxie's behavior was extraordinary. She maintained her wild instincts, as evidenced by her response to the intruder, but had formed a bond with Eleanor that defied conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. Give me time, he finally said. The board meeting isn't until Friday. Let me gather more evidence, document her behavior. Maybe we can find a compromise. While James worked frantically behind the scenes to save Moxie from bureaucratic judgment, the court of public opinion was already rendering its verdict. Officer Walton, contrary to usual police procedure, had shared details of the break-in with her sister, who happened to be the town's most prominent hairdresser. By midweek, the story of Eleanor and her protective bobcat had spread throughout the county, generating an outpouring of support that manifested in everything from casseroles left on Eleanor's porch to a hand-painted banner strung across Main Street reading, "Moxie Pinecrest's Hero." Regional news coverage quickly gained national attention. A producer from a morning television show left 6 messages on Eleanor's answering machine. Wildlife experts debated the implications of Moxie's behavior on cable news segments. An online petition titled "Save Moxie" gathered over 50,000 signatures in 36 hours. Eleanor, for her part, remained secluded in her home, emerging only to collect the increasingly elaborate offerings left on her porch. Flowers, gift baskets, handmade signs of support, and even toys clearly intended for a bobcat. She accepted these tokens with gracious nods to distant well-wishers, but refused all requests for interviews or photographs. Inside, life had settled into a new normal. Moxie, perhaps sensing the uncertainty of her situation, rarely strayed from Eleanor's side. The bobcat had taken to sleeping on the bed rather than in her usual spot in the sunroom, curled at Eleanor's feet like an oversized house cat. During the day, she followed Eleanor from room to room, watching her activities with intelligent, attentive eyes. "You understand more than they think you do, don't you?" Eleanor murmured one afternoon as she sat in her reading chair, Moxie sprawled on the rug beside her. "You're not just instinct and teeth and claws. There's something else in there. Moxie blinked slowly in response, a gesture that Eleanor had come to interpret as affection. The night before the board meeting, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table writing in a leather-bound journal while Moxie dozed nearby. The Bobcat's ears suddenly perked up, seconds before a knock sounded at the back door. Eleanor glanced at the clock, 9:45 p.m., far too late for a social call. "Who is it?" she called, one hand resting reassuringly on Moxie's back. "It's Sandra Walton, Mrs. Whitaker. May I speak with you?" Eleanor opened the door to find Officer Walton standing on her back step in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater rather than her uniform. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," the officer said, "but I thought you should know. Marcus Devlin was released from the hospital today and immediately filed a formal complaint against you in the Wildlife Center." Eleanor's expression remained impassive. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming negligence, reckless endangerment, failure to properly contain a dangerous animal. His lawyer is throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. It's mostly posturing, trying to set up a civil suit for damages." "I see." Eleanor stepped back. "Would you like to come in for tea, Officer Walton?" Sandra hesitated, her eyes finding Moxie, who had moved to sit in the kitchen doorway, watching the visitor with cautious interest. "Is it safe?" "Safer than most places in this town, I'd imagine," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Moxie only attacks criminals who break in during the night. For everyone else, she's perfectly civil." Officer Walton followed Eleanor into the kitchen, keeping a respectful distance from the Bobcat. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm not here officially. The department's position is clear. You were the victim of a crime, and what happened afterward was a consequence of that crime. But Devlin's complaint complicates things for your nephew's Wildlife Center. I thought you should be prepared for tomorrow's meeting." Eleanor set the kettle on the stove with deliberate calm. "Thank you for the warning, but I've lived long enough to know that bureaucracy rarely favors the remarkable. They'll do what's easiest, what protects them from liability. Moxie doesn't fit neatly into their categories, so they'll eliminate her rather than adapt their thinking. Unless," Officer Walton said slowly, "there was a compelling alternative." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly as she set 2 teacups on the table. "I'm listening." Officer Walton, Sandra, glanced at Moxie, who had settled into a sphinx-like position near Eleanor's chair, golden eyes fixed on the visitor with unnerving intensity. "Have you ever heard of animal therapy programs for law enforcement? Specifically wildlife education for crime prevention?" "I can't say that I have," Eleanor replied, pouring the tea with practiced precision. "That's because there aren't many," Sandra admitted. "But there should be. Look, I've been on the force for 20 years. In that time, I've seen a steady increase in residential break-ins, particularly targeting elderly residents. The statistics are frankly alarming." Eleanor nodded. "I'm aware. That's why Margaret Simmons down the street installed that ridiculous security system that announces every door and window opening as if it's a royal proclamation." Sandra smiled briefly before continuing. "Traditional deterrents, alarms, deadbolts, even security cameras, they're all reactive measures. They might record a crime or alert authorities after the fact, but they don't necessarily prevent the crime from occurring." Eleanor stirred a teaspoon of honey into her cup. "And how does Moxie factor into this?" "Education and awareness," Sandra said, warming to her topic. "Imagine a community outreach program where residents learn about home security through the lens of natural protection. Predators like Moxie instinctively defend their territory. They establish boundaries. They remain vigilant. They detect threats before they become immediate dangers. You're suggesting using Moxie as, what, a mascot for home security?" Sandra shook her head. "Not just a mascot, an ambassador. Think about it. Your case has already captured public attention. People are fascinated by the idea that a bobcat protected an elderly woman from harm. We could leverage that interest into an educational program that teaches people how to better protect their homes using principles from nature. Eleanor considered this, her eyes drifting to Moxie. And the Wildlife Center would benefit how exactly? Funding, for one thing. The police department has grants available for innovative crime prevention programs. The publicity would almost certainly increase donations to the center, but most importantly, it would provide a legitimate reason for Moxie to remain in rehabilitation rather than being euthanized or shipped off to some distant sanctuary. "You've given this quite a bit of thought," Eleanor observed. Sandra's expression turned slightly sheepish. "My brother-in-law sits on the Wildlife Center's board. He mentioned the meeting tomorrow, and I couldn't stop thinking about your situation. It seemed unjust that after Moxie protected you, the system would punish her for it." Eleanor studied the police officer with new appreciation. "Officer Walton, Sandra, I believe you might be a closet revolutionary." "Hardly," Sandra laughed. "I'm just a practical person who believes in finding solutions that benefit everyone. The department gets a new community outreach program, the Wildlife Center gets funding and positive publicity, and Moxie gets to continue her rehabilitation without being labeled a danger to society." "And what do I get?" Eleanor asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew the answer. "You get to keep your unusual roommate, at least for now." The two women spent the next hour refining the proposal, with Moxie maintaining her watchful presence throughout. By the time Sandra left, the outline of a natural home security initiative had taken shape, a program that would combine wildlife education with practical home security measures using Moxie's story as its foundation. As Eleanor locked the door behind her late-night visitor, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Well, Moxie," she said to the bobcat who had followed her to the door, "it seems we might have a fighting chance after all." The bobcat responded with a soft chirp, a sound Eleanor had come to associate with agreement. The morning of the board meeting dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect blue sky that seemed almost deliberately cheerful in contrast to the gravity of the day's agenda. Eleanor dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal gray suit that she hadn't worn since Frank's funeral 6 years earlier. Its slightly dated cut conveyed exactly the image she wanted to project. A respectable elderly woman who couldn't possibly be harboring dangerous impulses or criminal intent. James arrived to drive her to the meeting, his expression a mixture of hope and resignation. "Aunt Ellie, I need to prepare you. The board has already received legal advice suggesting that keeping Moxie in the program represents an unacceptable liability risk." "I understand," Eleanor replied calmly, checking her appearance in the hall mirror. "And have they received any advice regarding the public relations disaster they'll face if they condemn a heroic bobcat to death for protecting an old woman?" "I may have mentioned that perspective," James admitted. "There are some board members who are sympathetic, but they're also responsible for the center's financial well-being. One lawsuit could shut us down permanently." Eleanor nodded, picking up a slim folder from the hall table. "Then we'll have to ensure they understand all the available options." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor paused in the kitchen where Moxie was enjoying her morning meal. The bobcat looked up, chicken juice glistening on her whiskers. "Be good while I'm gone," Eleanor told her softly. "I'll be back as soon as I can." The Mountain Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center occupied a former cattle ranch 10 miles outside town. Its collection of buildings and enclosures spread across 30 acres of mixed woodland and meadow. Under normal circumstances, Eleanor enjoyed her visits there. James often invited her to observe releases of rehabilitated animals or to meet particularly charismatic residents. Today, however, the center felt oppressively institutional, with the main building's conference room transformed into something resembling a courtroom. The board, 7 volunteers from various professional backgrounds, sat along one side of a long table with James at one end in his capacity as center director. Eleanor was directed to a chair positioned to face the board, making her feel distinctly like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Mrs. Whitaker, thank you for joining us today," began Diane Mercer, the board chair and local bank manager. "We want to assure you that we take this situation very seriously and that our primary concern is ensuring both public safety and the proper care of the animals in our charge." Eleanor nodded politely, folding her hands in her lap. "Of course, and I appreciate the difficult position the board finds itself in. Moxie's situation is certainly unusual." "Unusual is putting it mildly," interjected Howard Grange, a retired attorney whose perpetual scowl suggested he approached all of life's problems as potential lawsuits. "We have a documented case of a rehabilitation animal attacking a human being. The liability implications are staggering." "The human being in question was committing a felony at the time," Eleanor pointed out mildly, "and Moxie's behavior was entirely defensive." "That may be," Howard continued, "but the fact remains that this animal has now demonstrated aggressive behavior toward humans. Our protocols are very clear in such cases." "If I may," James intervened, "Moxie's behavior was consistent with territorial defense, not random aggression. She responded to a perceived threat in her environment, exactly as she would in the wild." The discussion continued in this vein for nearly 30 minutes, with technical arguments about liability, precedent, and wildlife rehabilitation protocols dominating the conversation. Eleanor observed the dynamics carefully, noting which board members seemed sympathetic and which remained firmly opposed to any compromise. Finally, during a brief lull, she spoke up. "If the board would permit me, I have a proposal I'd like to present." Diane looked momentarily surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker. We'd be interested to hear your thoughts." Eleanor opened her folder and distributed copies of the document she and Sandra had prepared the night before. "What I'm proposing is a new educational initiative, a partnership between the Wildlife Center, the police department, and community services that would use Moxie's story as the foundation for a home security awareness program." As the board members scanned the proposal, Eleanor continued, "Officer Sandra Walton of the Pinecrest Police Department has already expressed support for this initiative and believes there are grant funds available for exactly this kind of innovative community outreach." "This is unorthodox," Diane said slowly, though her tone suggested interest rather than dismissal. "So is having a Bobcat stop a home invasion," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Sometimes unorthodox situations call for unorthodox solutions." For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor outlined the Natural Home Security Initiative in detail, drawing on her decades of experience as an educator to present a compelling vision of a program that would serve multiple community needs while providing Moxie with a legitimate role in human society. The most remarkable aspect of Moxie's behavior that night wasn't that she attacked an intruder, Eleanor concluded. It was that she stopped when I called her name. She demonstrated an extraordinary ability to distinguish between threat and non-threat, between appropriate and inappropriate aggression. That kind of discernment is precisely what makes her valuable, not just as a rehabilitation animal, but as an educational ambassador. As Eleanor finished speaking, the conference room fell silent. She could see the board members exchanging glances, their expressions suggesting that her proposal had, at minimum, complicated what they had assumed would be a straightforward decision. "This is certainly creative," Howard admitted reluctantly, "though I still have significant concerns about liability, which is why the proposal includes specific protocols for Moxie's handling during educational events," Eleanor countered. She would never be in direct contact with the public. James would maintain full control at all times. Diane tapped her pen thoughtfully against the table. We'll need to discuss this privately. Mrs. Whitaker, would you mind stepping outside while the board deliberates? Eleanor nodded graciously and rose from her chair. Of course. Thank you for your consideration. In the hallway outside the conference room, Eleanor found herself facing another unexpected ally, Dr. Ramona Diaz, the wildlife specialist who had assessed Moxie after the break-in. Mrs. Whitaker, Dr. Diaz greeted her warmly. I heard about today's meeting and wanted to lend my support. From a behavioral perspective, Moxie's actions were textbook territorial defense, not pathological aggression. Thank you, Doctor, Eleanor replied. I appreciate your professional assessment. Dr. Diaz glanced at the closed conference room door. I've submitted my formal evaluation to the board, but I wanted to tell you personally, in 20 years of wildlife medicine, I've never seen a bobcat form the kind of bond Moxie has with you. It's scientifically fascinating and, frankly, rather beautiful. Eleanor and Dr. Diaz waited in tense silence, occasionally exchanging comments about Moxie's health and behavior, but mostly lost in their own thoughts. 45 minutes stretched into an hour, then nearly 90 minutes before the conference room door finally opened. Mrs. Whitaker, Diane called. We're ready for you now. Eleanor rose with as much dignity as her arthritic knees would allow, smoothing her suit jacket as she prepared to face whatever decision had been reached. Dr. Diaz gave her arm a reassuring squeeze before she re-entered the conference room. The board members' expressions were carefully neutral, offering no immediate hint of their decision. Eleanor resumed her seat, folding her hands in her lap and waiting with the patience of a woman who had lived long enough to know that nothing good comes from rushing important moments. Diane cleared her throat. Mrs. Whitaker, after careful consideration of your proposal, consultation with our legal advisors, and review of expert testimony regarding Moxie's behavior, the board has reached a decision. Eleanor nodded, her expression betraying nothing of the anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. We have decided to approve a 6-month pilot program for the Natural Home Security Initiative with certain conditions, Diane continued. During this period, Moxie will remain officially under the center's care but will continue her rehabilitation at your residence, subject to weekly assessments by our staff. Relief washed through Eleanor, though she maintained her composure. I understand. What are the conditions? Howard Grange consulted a legal pad in front of him. First, you must agree to enhance security measures at your home to prevent any possibility of Moxie escaping or having unauthorized contact with the public. Second, your nephew James will be Moxie's official handler for all educational events. You will not transport or handle Moxie outside your home without his supervision. Third, you must carry additional liability insurance, which the center will help arrange. Fourth, you must agree to participate in at least 6 public educational events as part of the initiative. And finally, Diane added with a hint of a smile, you must agree to allow a small camera crew to document Moxie's story for educational purposes. The resulting video will be used for fundraising and awareness. Eleanor considered these terms carefully. The additional security and insurance seem reasonable, as does James's role as official handler. The educational events are precisely what I proposed. Regarding the documentation, I have some concerns about privacy, but I'm willing to discuss parameters. Of course, Diane agreed. The documentation would be focused primarily on Moxie and the educational aspects of the program, not on your personal life. Eleanor nodded her acceptance. Then it appears we have an agreement. The drive home was considerably lighter in mood than the journey to the center had been. James could barely contain his excitement, peppering the conversation with ideas for the educational program and plans for adapting Eleanor's home to meet the center's enhanced security requirements. We'll need to install special locks on the exterior doors, possibly a designated secure room for Moxie during visits from anyone outside the approved list, he explained, his mind clearly racing ahead. The sunroom could be modified with a proper secure enclosure. Not a cage exactly, but something that would satisfy the board's requirements while still allowing Moxie freedom of movement. Eleanor smiled, watching the countryside pass by her window. You seem rather pleased with this outcome for someone who was so worried about liability. James shot her a quick grin. Are you kidding? This is revolutionary, Aunt Ellie. No rehabilitation center in the country has attempted a program like this. If it succeeds, it could change how we approach animals that can't be fully released back into the wild. Not to mention, it's a perfect blend of my two passions, wildlife conservation and community education. Not to mention it keeps your aunt happy, Eleanor added dryly. That too, James admitted, though I'm still trying to figure out how you managed to convert a potential disaster into a groundbreaking program in less than a week. I've had 78 years to learn that problems often contain their own solutions, if you're willing to look at them from an unexpected angle. Eleanor gazed thoughtfully out the window. Besides, I had help. Officer Walton's insights were crucial. As they pulled into Eleanor's driveway, James's expression turned more serious. There's still the matter of Marcus Devlin's complaint and potential lawsuit. The board's decision doesn't make that go away. No, Eleanor agreed, gathering her purse. But it does mean we're facing it from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. There's a significant difference between dangerous animal attacks innocent man and specially trained wildlife ambassador protects elderly woman from convicted felon. Inside the house, Moxie greeted them with unusual enthusiasm, chirping and weaving around Eleanor's ankles in a manner more typical of a domestic cat than a wild bobcat. Eleanor couldn't help wondering if the animal somehow sensed the positive outcome of the meeting. Yes, we won, Eleanor told her, bending carefully to stroke the bobcat's spotted head. You get to stay, though there will be some changes around here. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity, as Eleanor's home was transformed to meet the center's security requirements. The sunroom was outfitted with a specially designed enclosure that could be secured when necessary, but left open for Moxie's free movement throughout the house at other times. Special locks were installed on all exterior doors and windows. A dedicated phone line was set up for the Natural Home Security Initiative, which immediately began receiving calls from media outlets and community organizations interested in the program. Sandra Walton proved invaluable during this transition, helping to navigate bureaucratic hurdles and accelerating permit approvals through her connections at City Hall. Within a week, official approval had been granted for the pilot program, along with preliminary funding from the police department's community outreach budget. The most surreal moment came when Eleanor opened her door one morning to find a film crew on her porch, led by a young woman who introduced herself as Melissa Chen, the documentary filmmaker commissioned by the Wildlife Center. Mrs. Whitaker, it's an honor to meet you, Melissa said, offering her hand. Your story with Moxie has captured so many people's imagination. I'm hoping to create a documentary that not only tells that story, but helps people understand the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in the modern world. Eleanor regarded the young woman thoughtfully. And how do you envision telling this story, Ms. Chen? With authenticity and respect, Melissa replied without hesitation. No sensationalism, no manufactured drama, just the remarkable truth of what happened here and what you and Moxie are creating together. Eleanor nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then you may come in, though I should warn you, Moxie has her own opinions about being filmed. She's rather particular about her angles. The filmmaker laughed, clearly thinking Eleanor was joking. 3 hours later, after Moxie had systematically avoided every camera setup, knocking over a light stand in the process, Melissa was forced to concede that the Bobcat did indeed have strong feelings about cinematography. "I've filmed skittish wildlife before," she admitted as she reviewed the scant usable footage they'd managed to capture, but never encountered quite this level of deliberate camera avoidance. Eleanor smiled, watching Moxie groom herself nonchalantly on the kitchen counter, positioned perfectly between two of the filmmaker's carefully placed cameras. "Moxie understands more than people give her credit for. If you want her cooperation, you'll need to earn her trust first. That takes time." "How did you do it?" Melissa asked, genuinely curious. "I didn't try to," Eleanor replied simply. "That was the key, I think. I never expected anything from her, never demanded her attention or affection. I simply created a safe space and allowed her to decide how she wanted to inhabit it." That evening, after the film crew had departed with promises to return after rethinking their approach, Eleanor received an unexpected phone call. The number displayed on her caller ID belonged to the district attorney's office. "Mrs. Whitaker, this is District Attorney Patricia Hammond. I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, though the formality of the call set off warning bells in her mind. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to inform you personally that my office has decided not to pursue any charges related to the incident at your home involving the Bobcat in your care." Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. While James had assured her that charges were unlikely, the official confirmation was nevertheless a relief. "Thank you for letting me know. However," the DA continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I should also inform you that Mr. Devlin's attorney has filed a civil lawsuit against both you and the Wildlife Center seeking damages for his injuries." "I see," Eleanor said, her voice remaining steady despite the surge of anger she felt. "May I ask why you're calling to tell me this? Civil matters aren't typically the domain of the district attorney's office." There was a brief pause before Patricia Hammond answered. "Off the record, Mrs. Whitaker, I wanted to give you a heads up because this case has attracted significant attention and I thought you should be prepared and, well, my mother is 82 and lives alone. What happened to you could have happened to her, except she wouldn't have had Moxie to protect her." The personal admission surprised Eleanor. "Thank you for your candor, Ms. Hammond. I've also asked our Victim Services Coordinator to contact you. While technically Mr. Devlin is being prosecuted as the perpetrator in the criminal case, his civil suit may entitle you to certain resources and support services." After ending the call, Eleanor sat in her living room, processing this new development. Moxie, sensing her distress, abandoned her perch by the window and came to sit beside Eleanor's chair, her warm presence a silent comfort. The news of Marcus Devlin's lawsuit arrived like a dark cloud on an otherwise brightening horizon. Eleanor had spent the morning reviewing educational materials James had prepared for their first community presentation, scheduled for the following week at the Pinecrest Community Center. The initiative was taking shape more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, fueled by a surge of interest that extended well beyond their small town. "He's asking for $250,000 in damages," James informed her the next morning, having received the formal notification from the Wildlife Center's legal team. Claims for physical injury, emotional distress, loss of income, and, this is the part that really gets me, punitive damages for reckless endangerment through harboring a dangerous predator in a residential area. Eleanor set down her teacup with deliberate calm. The irony being that the only dangerous predator in my home that night was the one trying to steal my silverware. "Exactly," James agreed, pacing Eleanor's kitchen in agitation. "The center's lawyers think it's mostly posturing. Devlin's attorney is a personal injury specialist who works on contingency. He gets paid only if they win. These types typically file outrageous claims hoping for a quick settlement." "And what do the lawyers recommend?" "Fighting it, surprisingly. They believe we have a strong case given the circumstances. Devlin was committing a felony, Moxie was legally on the premises with proper permits, and there's clear evidence of defensive rather than aggressive behavior. James paused, glancing at Moxie, who was observing their conversation from her favorite spot atop the refrigerator. Plus, there's the matter of public opinion, which is overwhelmingly in your favor. That was an understatement. In the days since the board's approval of the Natural Home Security Initiative, Eleanor and Moxie had become unlikely celebrities. Local businesses displayed "We Stand with Moxie" signs in their windows. The town's most popular cafe had introduced a Moxie mocha, extra fierce according to the chalkboard menu. Eleanor had received over 200 cards and letters from well-wishers, many including donations for Moxie's care or the Wildlife Center. More significantly, the initiative itself had attracted serious attention from law enforcement agencies and community safety organizations across the state. What had begun as a creative solution to save one bobcat from euthanasia was evolving into a genuine educational movement, with Eleanor and Moxie at its center. "So we fight," Eleanor said simply. "I've never been one to reward bullies, and I'm certainly not going to start at 78. That afternoon, Eleanor met with Catherine Blakely, the attorney assigned to her case by the Wildlife Center's legal team. Catherine was in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes behind stylish glasses and the polished confidence of someone who had spent decades winning difficult cases. She arrived at Eleanor's home precisely on time, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and wearing a suit that Eleanor suspected cost more than her monthly pension. "Mrs. Whitaker, it's a pleasure to meet you," Catherine said, accepting Eleanor's invitation into the living room. "I've been following your story with great interest. Please, call me Eleanor, and thank you for taking my case." Catherine smiled as she settled into the armchair Eleanor indicated. "I specifically requested it, actually. It's not often I get to defend someone who's clearly in the right, both legally and morally." Their discussion of legal strategy was briefly interrupted when Moxie sauntered into the living room, giving Catherine a thorough visual inspection before jumping onto the back of the sofa, where she could observe the visitor from a position of advantage. "And this must be the famous Moxie," Catherine said, admirably unfazed by the proximity of a wild predator. "She's even more impressive in person." "She's deciding whether you're trustworthy," Eleanor explained. "She's become quite protective since the incident." "Smart girl," Catherine replied, directly addressing the bobcat. "And I am trustworthy, especially when it comes to protecting you and your human from nuisance lawsuits." As if understanding, Moxie settled into a sphinx-like position, her attention now divided between the conversation and the bird feeder, visible through the window. "Now then," Catherine continued, turning back to Eleanor, "here's how I see this case. Devlin's lawsuit rests on portraying you as negligent for having a dangerous wild animal in your home. Our counter-narrative is straightforward. Moxie is a rehabilitation animal under proper permits and supervision, who acted defensively against a home invader with a criminal record. The fact that Moxie responded to your verbal command to stop the attack actually strengthens our position, as it demonstrates she wasn't out of control. That's essentially what Dr. Diaz concluded in her behavioral assessment," Eleanor confirmed. "Exactly, and her expert testimony will be invaluable." Catherine opened her briefcase and removed a slim folder. "There's also the matter of Mr. Devlin's extensive criminal history, which undermines his credibility significantly. 3 prior convictions for breaking and entering, plus a history of filing dubious injury claims. Did you know this is the 3rd time he's sued someone after injuring himself while committing a crime on their property?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "No, I wasn't aware of that. It's a pattern with him. 2 years ago, he sued a restaurant owner after cutting himself on a broken window he was attempting to climb through after hours. Before that, he sued an elderly couple when their garden rake injured him as he fled their garage with stolen tools. Catherine's expression turned grim. He lost both cases, but not before putting his victims through considerable stress and expense. So he's making a habit of this, Eleanor observed. It's his attorney's strategy: file outrageous claims, drag out proceedings until defendants get tired or scared, then push for a settlement. Catherine closed the folder decisively. But they've miscalculated this time. The Wildlife Center has deep pockets and excellent insurance, and your case has generated too much public support for them to abandon you. Plus, you have me. And what do you recommend as our next steps? Eleanor asked. First, we file a robust response to their complaint, denying all allegations and countering with the facts of the break-in. Second, we prepare for depositions. Yours, James's, and Dr. Diaz's will be particularly important. Third, we gather documentation of Moxie's rehabilitation status, permits, and behavioral assessments. Catherine glanced at the Bobcat, who had begun grooming herself with typical feline indifference to human concerns. And finally, we continue with the Natural Home Security Initiative as planned. The more established and legitimate the program becomes, the stronger our position that Moxie is not merely a dangerous wild animal, but a valuable educational ambassador serving a public safety purpose. As Catherine packed up her materials, she added, "By the way, I've taken the liberty of contacting several prominent wildlife law experts who are interested in filing amicus briefs on your behalf. This case could potentially set an important precedent for rehabilitation animals." After the lawyer departed, Eleanor sat quietly reflecting on how her life had transformed in the span of a few short weeks, from a peaceful, perhaps slightly lonely retirement to the center of a legal battle and a pioneering educational initiative, and all because a bobcat and a burglar had the misfortune to encounter each other in her kitchen. "What do you think of all this, Moxie?" She asked the bobcat, who had migrated to the windowsill to better track the movements of a squirrel in the yard. "Are you enjoying your newfound fame?" Moxie turned to regard her with those inscrutable golden eyes before uttering a soft chirp, the vocalization Eleanor had come to interpret as general agreement. The following days were filled with preparations for the initiative's first public event. James arrived each morning with new materials, schedules, and ideas, his enthusiasm for the project growing with each passing day. Sandra Walton coordinated with local senior centers and community groups to ensure strong attendance. The documentary film crew, having earned at least Moxie's grudging tolerance, if not her cooperation, captured footage of the preparations. For the event itself, a special portable enclosure had been designed, secure enough to satisfy safety requirements but with clear panels that would allow audiences to see Moxie while James and Eleanor presented. They had decided on a format that would begin with Eleanor recounting the break-in, the parts suitable for public consumption at least, followed by James explaining bobcat behavior and natural territorial defenses, then transitioning to practical home security measures inspired by wildlife protection strategies. The key is making the connection between natural defense mechanisms and human security practices, James explained as they rehearsed in Eleanor's living room. Bobcats establish boundaries, maintain awareness of their surroundings, and respond appropriately to threats, all principles that translate to effective home security. Eleanor nodded, though her mind had drifted to a more fundamental question. "James, do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing for Moxie? Using her story this way, turning her into a symbol?" James paused, considering the question seriously. "I ask myself that every day. The wildlife rehabilitator in me knows that in an ideal world, Moxie would either be fully wild or in a specialized sanctuary. But we don't live in an ideal world." He glanced at Moxie, who was watching their rehearsal with apparent interest from her perch on the bookshelf. "The reality is that Moxie can never be fully wild again. Her early imprinting on humans saw to that, and most sanctuaries would keep her in an enclosure for the rest of her life. Whereas here, she has freedom, purpose and connection, Eleanor completed the thought. Exactly. Is it perfect? No. Is it better than the alternatives? I believe so. James smiled ruefully. Sometimes conservation isn't about perfect solutions. It's about finding the best possible path forward with the circumstances we have. The morning of their first public presentation dawned with a nervous energy permeating Eleanor's home. She had risen earlier than usual, carefully selecting a navy blue dress that projected both authority and approachability. In the kitchen, she found Moxie already alert, as if sensing the day's importance. Today's the big day, Eleanor told the Bobcat as she prepared her morning tea. Are you ready for your public debut? Moxie responded by stretching languorously before accepting a piece of chicken from Eleanor's hand, a level of trust that had developed gradually over their months together. The gesture struck Eleanor as particularly poignant given what lay ahead. Today, they would publicly affirm their unusual partnership, transforming what had begun as a temporary arrangement into something more deliberate and defined. James arrived precisely at 9, driving the Wildlife Center's van equipped with Moxie's specially designed travel enclosure. Nervous? He asked as he helped Eleanor gather her notes and presentation materials. Not about speaking, Eleanor replied. I spent 40 years commanding the attention of restless children as a school librarian. A room full of adults holds no terror for me. She glanced toward Moxie, who was watching their preparations with evident suspicion. I'm more concerned about how she'll handle the transition. Their carefully developed protocol for transporting Moxie involved a series of steps designed to minimize stress. First, James set up the travel enclosure in the sunroom where Moxie was most comfortable. Next, he placed her favorite enrichment toys inside, along with familiar bedding material. Finally, with gentle coaxing and considerable patience, they encouraged Moxie to enter the enclosure of her own accord. Today, however, Moxie had other ideas. After circling the enclosure suspiciously, she retreated to the top of the refrigerator, her preferred vantage point when feeling insecure. She knows something's different, Eleanor observed, checking her watch. They had allowed an extra hour for this possibility, but the cushion was rapidly shrinking. James nodded, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the growing time pressure. Let's give her a few minutes to adjust. Forcing the issue will only make things worse. 20 minutes later, with Moxie still firmly ensconced on her refrigerator perch, Eleanor decided on a different approach. She sat on a kitchen chair, positioning herself at eye level with the Bobcat. Moxie, she said in the measured tone she had used with generations of children caught misbehaving in her library, I understand you're apprehensive. Change is difficult for all of us, but this is important. Not just for us, but for others like you who deserve a chance to find their place in this complicated world we've created. James watched with fascination as Eleanor continued her quiet monologue, explaining to Moxie in simple, direct terms why they needed her cooperation and what would happen during the day ahead. Whether it was the content of the speech or simply the familiar, calming cadence of Eleanor's voice, the effect was remarkable. Moxie's rigid posture gradually relaxed, her tail stopped twitching with agitation, and her ears rotated forward in what James recognized as attentive interest. When Eleanor finally stood and walked toward the sunroom, Moxie followed, jumping down from the refrigerator with unexpected grace for an animal her size. To James's astonishment, the Bobcat entered the travel enclosure voluntarily, settling onto the familiar bedding with only a brief glance back at Eleanor. I'll be right there with you, Eleanor assured her, securing the enclosure door. We're doing this together. The drive to the Pinecrest Community Center took 15 minutes, during which Moxie remained surprisingly calm, occasionally making soft chirping sounds when Eleanor spoke to her. They arrived to find the parking lot already filling with cars, a promising sign for their first event. Inside, Sandra Walton greeted them, her usual police uniform replaced by business attire befitting her role as program coordinator. We've got a full house, she reported. Over 200 registered attendees, including representatives from 6 neighboring police departments, 3 senior centers, and the state's Victim Services Agency. The setup was exactly as they had planned. A small stage with a podium, chairs arranged in a semicircle for the audience, and a space for Moxie's presentation enclosure, larger and more comfortable than the travel unit, with clear panels allowing visibility while maintaining security. The documentary crew had positioned cameras discreetly around the room, following Eleanor's strict instructions to remain unobtrusive. As James supervised the transition of Moxie from the travel enclosure to the presentation habitat, Eleanor took a moment to scan the audience filing into the room. Most were seniors, reflecting the program's initial focus on vulnerable populations, but she noted younger faces as well, including several she recognized as local reporters. In the back row, partially obscured by a support column, sat Catherine Blakely, their attorney, her presence both a show of support and a strategic move to observe public response. 5 minutes, Mrs. Whitaker, the event coordinator informed her, handing Eleanor a wireless microphone. We're at capacity, and we've had to turn people away. There's talk of scheduling a second session later this week. The presentation began with Sandra Walton introducing the Natural Home Security Initiative, explaining its origins and objectives. She then welcomed Eleanor to the stage, where the elderly woman was greeted with enthusiastic applause, a reminder of how thoroughly her story had captured the community's imagination. Good morning, Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. 3 months ago, I was a perfectly ordinary widow, living a quiet life in a modest house on Maple Street. The most exciting thing in my weekly routine was the bridge club meeting every Thursday afternoon. She paused, allowing a gentle wave of laughter to pass through the audience. That changed rather dramatically one Tuesday night when a young man named Marcus Devlin decided my home would be an easy target. For the next 15 minutes, Eleanor recounted the events of that night, carefully balancing the factual details with her personal experience, omitting the more graphic elements while conveying the genuine fear and subsequent relief she had felt. Throughout her narrative, she occasionally glanced toward Moxie, who had settled into her temporary enclosure with surprising dignity, observing the proceedings with alert interest. When the lights came on and I saw this masked stranger in my kitchen, I was certain my 78 years on this earth were about to come to an abrupt end, Eleanor continued. What I couldn't know, what neither of us could know, was that there was a third participant in this drama. Moxie, who had been temporarily residing in my home as part of her rehabilitation, had her own ideas about uninvited guests. As planned, this was James's cue to join Eleanor on stage, beginning the educational portion of the presentation. With the practiced ease of someone accustomed to public speaking, he explained Bobcat territorial behavior, drawing parallels to human security concerns. Bobcats, like most predators, are constantly aware of their surroundings, James explained, indicating Moxie, who seemed to prove his point by tracking his movements with her attentive gaze. They establish clear territorial boundaries, they maintain vigilance, and they respond appropriately to threats. These are all principles we can apply to our own security practices. The audience's attention shifted between James's informative explanation and Moxie herself, who had become the living embodiment of the concepts he described. Occasionally, Moxie would move within her enclosure, stretching or changing position, drawing soft gasps of appreciation from those who had never seen a bobcat at such close range. As they transitioned to the practical portion of the presentation, Sandra demonstrating simple home security measures inspired by wildlife behaviors, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of triumph. The initiative was working exactly as they had envisioned, using Moxie's story as a bridge between wildlife conservation and human safety. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on the security recommendations. During the brief intermission, as attendees enjoyed refreshments in an adjacent room, Catherine Blakely approached Eleanor with a satisfied smile. "That was remarkably effective," the attorney said. "You've transformed Moxie from a potential liability into a valuable community asset. If this keeps up, Devlin's lawsuit won't stand a chance." The success of their first presentation catalyzed a surge of interest in the Natural Home Security Initiative. What had begun as a creative solution to save one bobcat quickly expanded into a multifaceted program that gained recognition far beyond Pinecrest. Within 3 weeks, Eleanor and Moxie had participated in 6 more presentations, each one drawing larger crowds than the last. Law enforcement agencies from neighboring states began sending representatives to observe the program, exploring how similar initiatives might be implemented in their own communities. "You've become quite the celebrity," Sandra remarked one afternoon as she helped Eleanor sort through the stacks of mail that arrived daily. Letters from seniors sharing their own security concerns, inquiries from wildlife rehabilitation centers interested in similar programs, and even fan mail addressed specifically to Moxie. "Accidental celebrity," Eleanor corrected, setting aside a particularly touching letter from an elderly man who credited their presentation with giving him the confidence to continue living independently after a frightening attempted break-in. "I never sought the spotlight. Neither did Moxie." As if hearing her name, the Bobcat sauntered into the living room, more relaxed now with Sandra's presence after several weeks of association. The officer had become a regular visitor to Eleanor's home, her role expanding beyond program coordination to genuine friendship. "Speaking of spotlight," Sandra said, pulling a folded newspaper from her bag, "you made the front page again." Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses to examine the paper. The headline read, "Wildlife Hero and Senior Advocate, How a Bobcat is Changing Home Security." Beneath it was a photograph of Eleanor and Moxie at their most recent presentation, the elderly woman speaking animatedly while the Bobcat observed from her enclosure, looking remarkably dignified. "They always make me look so serious," Eleanor mused, more concerned with her own appearance than the flattering article. "That's because you are serious about this work," Sandra replied. "People respond to authenticity. You and Moxie have given a face to 2 issues people care deeply about: elder safety and wildlife conservation. You've made them personal." As their public profile rose, developments in the legal arena continued in parallel. Catherine Blakely called weekly with updates on Marcus Devlin's lawsuit, which was proceeding through the preliminary phases of litigation. "Devlin's attorney requested your deposition next month," Catherine informed Eleanor during one such call. "I've managed to delay it, arguing that your community service schedule constitutes a hardship. In reality, I want them to see more press coverage of the initiative before they question you under oath." "Is that ethical?" Eleanor asked, though there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Completely," Catherine assured her. "Scheduling considerations are a normal part of litigation. Besides, every successful presentation you give strengthens our case that Moxie is a valuable educational resource, not a dangerous animal kept irresponsibly." The initiative's growing success was mirrored by continued evolution in Eleanor and Moxie's relationship. As the Bobcat became accustomed to the routine of public appearances, she demonstrated remarkable adaptability. James, with his professional perspective, observed these changes with fascination. "Her behavior is extraordinary," he told Eleanor after a particularly successful event where Moxie had remained calm despite a child accidentally dropping a tray of refreshments with a startling crash. "Most bobcats would never acclimate to this level of human exposure, let alone appear to understand their role in it. She's always understood more than people give her credit for," Eleanor replied, recalling how Moxie had stopped her attack on the intruder at the sound of her voice. "She's making choices, not just responding to instincts." This idea, That Moxie possessed a level of agency and understanding beyond typical wildlife became central to their legal strategy. Dr. Diaz conducted formal behavioral assessments, documenting Moxie's responses to various stimuli and her interactions with Eleanor. The resulting report provided scientific validation for what Eleanor had intuitively recognized. Moxie was exceptional, falling somewhere in the undefined space between wild animal and domesticated companion. 5 weeks after their first presentation, as the initiative gained momentum and the legal proceedings moved forward, an unexpected complication arose. Eleanor awoke one morning to find Moxie unusually lethargic, refusing her breakfast and moving with obvious discomfort. "Something's wrong," she told James in a voice tight with worry when he arrived for their scheduled presentation preparation. "She's not herself. We need to cancel today." James, immediately shifting from program director to wildlife veterinarian, conducted a careful examination while Eleanor hovered anxiously nearby. "Her temperature's elevated, and there's tenderness in her abdomen," he reported. "We need to get her to the center's medical facility. This could be related to her previous surgery." The next few hours passed in a blur of anxiety for Eleanor. The Wildlife Center's veterinary facility, though state-of-the-art for animal care, offered none of the comforts of a human hospital waiting room. She sat on a metal folding chair in the administrative office, declining offers of coffee or tea, her thoughts fixed on the treatment room where Moxie was undergoing examination and diagnostic tests. When James finally emerged, his expression was serious but not grave. "It's an infection, likely a recurrence related to her spay surgery months ago. We've started her on antibiotics, and she'll need to stay here for at least 48 hours for monitoring and treatment." "I should stay with her," Eleanor said immediately. James shook his head gently. "That's not possible, Aunt Ellie. This is a secure medical facility, not set up for visitors. Besides, she'll be mostly sleeping from the medication." "She'll be frightened waking up in a strange place," Eleanor insisted, her voice cracking slightly. "She needs familiar presence." James regarded his aunt with compassion, recognizing that her concern went beyond normal attachment to a rehabilitation animal. "I'll arrange for you to visit tomorrow morning, but only briefly, and I promise to call with updates every few hours." Eleanor returned to a house that felt suddenly, achingly empty. Over the months of their cohabitation, Moxie's presence had filled spaces Eleanor hadn't realized were vacant. The silent corners of rooms, the long evening hours, the quiet mornings that had once stretched endlessly before her. Now those spaces yawned open again, reminding Eleanor of the solitude that had been her constant companion in the years since Frank's death. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, preparing a cup of tea she didn't drink, turning on the television only to mute it immediately, finally settling in her reading chair with a book she couldn't focus on. When the phone rang at 9 o'clock, she lunged for it with uncharacteristic urgency. "She's resting comfortably," James reported. "The antibiotics seem to be working already. Her fever's down, and she ate a little when the technician offered food." "Did she seem upset, anxious?" Eleanor pressed. "Actually, she's been remarkably calm," James said. "The technician mentioned she was much easier to handle than most wild patients, almost as if she understood they were helping her." After hanging up, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of the sunroom, where Moxie's favorite blanket still lay in a pool of moonlight on the window seat. The sight brought a tightness to her throat that surprised her with its intensity. She had known from the beginning that her time with Moxie was temporary. Rehabilitation always aimed toward eventual release or relocation. Yet somehow, in the midst of legal battles and public presentations, that fundamental truth had receded from her conscious thoughts. "She was never meant to stay," Eleanor whispered to the empty room, acknowledging the reality she had been carefully avoiding. Moxie's illness had forced a recognition she had been unwilling to face. However special their connection, however successful their partnership in the initiative, Moxie remained a wild animal with needs and instincts that transcended human companionship. The following morning, when Eleanor arrived at the Wildlife Center's medical facility, she found James waiting with news that temporarily overshadowed her philosophical concerns. "There's been a development in the legal case," he said, leading her toward the treatment area. "Catherine called early this morning. Marcus Devlin was arrested last night for attempting to break into another home, the residence of Judge Martin Cooper." Eleanor stopped short. "The same judge overseeing his lawsuit against us?" James nodded, a grim satisfaction in his expression. Apparently, Devlin didn't recognize the name or address, just saw an apparently vulnerable target. "The judge had installed new security measures after attending one of your presentations last week. Devlin was apprehended before he even made it through the back door." The irony of Marcus Devlin's situation wasn't lost on anyone involved. The burglar whose lawsuit had threatened Moxie's future had effectively sabotaged his own case by attempting to break into the home of the very judge who would have presided over it. Within 24 hours of his arrest, Devlin's attorney filed a motion to withdraw from the civil case, and 3 days later the lawsuit was formally dismissed. "Sometimes justice has a peculiar sense of humor," Catherine Blakely remarked when she called Eleanor with the news. Judge Cooper was particularly irritated to discover that the security system that caught Devlin was installed based on recommendations from your program, the very program Devlin's lawsuit claimed was dangerous and irresponsible. "Is that the end of it then?" Eleanor asked, glancing toward the sunroom where Moxie was recuperating after her return from the Wildlife Center's medical facility. The Bobcat's infection had responded well to treatment, though she remained on antibiotics and moved with a deliberate carefulness that tugged at Eleanor's heart. "Legally, yes," Catherine confirmed. "Devlin is facing multiple felony charges, including violation of his parole. Given his record and the circumstances of his arrest, he'll likely be incarcerated for a significant period. The civil suit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning he can't refile it." For Eleanor, the dismissal of the lawsuit brought a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty. With the immediate legal threat removed, the question of Moxie's long-term future resurfaced with new urgency. The Bobcat's illness had crystallized Eleanor's understanding that their arrangement, however mutually beneficial, remained fundamentally transitional. "The board wants to meet with us next week," James told her when he stopped by to check on Moxie's recovery. "The 6-month pilot program is nearing its halfway point, and they want to discuss next steps." Eleanor nodded, watching as Moxie stretched cautiously on her sunroom perch, the afternoon light catching the distinctive patterns of her coat. "I've been thinking about that too." James studied his aunt carefully. "You've come to a decision, haven't you?" "Not a decision exactly," Eleanor replied. "More of a recognition. Moxie deserves a life that honors her nature, not just her exceptional ability to adapt to humans. The question is what that life should look like." The board meeting took place on a crisp autumn morning, with the Wildlife Center's conference room bathed in golden light that seemed to underscore the transitional nature of the season. Unlike the tense session months earlier, this gathering had an atmosphere of collaborative planning rather than judgment. "The Natural Home Security Initiative has exceeded our most optimistic projections," Diane Mercer began, consulting the data before her. "Participation rates, community engagement, media coverage, and most importantly, measurable impact on home security awareness among vulnerable populations, all substantially above benchmark. And that's not even considering the unprecedented interest from other wildlife rehabilitation centers wanting to develop similar programs." Eleanor listened as board members took turns highlighting various aspects of the program's success. Howard Grange, once their most vocal skeptic, seemed particularly enthusiastic about the initiative's fundraising potential, noting that donations to the center had increased by 40% since the program's inception. Which brings us to the question of next steps, Diane continued, turning her attention to Eleanor. The pilot was originally conceived as a 6-month program with Moxie remaining in your home under specified conditions. Given the program's success and the resolution of the legal concerns, we'd like to propose extending this arrangement indefinitely, with Moxie officially reclassified from rehabilitation animal to educational ambassador. Eleanor had anticipated this offer. It represented in many ways the ideal outcome: formal recognition of Moxie's special status and continued support for their living arrangement. Yet she hesitated, conscious of the deeper questions she had been wrestling with since Moxie's illness. "Before I respond," she said carefully, "I'd like to hear from James and Dr. Diaz about what this would mean for Moxie's well-being long-term." James exchanged a glance with Dr. Diaz, who had joined the meeting to provide her professional assessment. "From a behavioral perspective," Dr. Diaz began, "Moxie has demonstrated remarkable adaptability to her current situation. Her interactions with Eleanor show a level of bonding atypical for her species, and her tolerance for controlled public exposure indicates she's not experiencing undue stress from the program activities. However," James added, picking up the thread, "we have to consider her physical health as well. The recent infection was a reminder that Moxie's early life circumstances, being kept illegally as a pet, then the trauma of abandonment followed by her spay surgery, have left her with vulnerabilities. She'll need ongoing medical monitoring and possibly additional treatment as she ages." Eleanor nodded, absorbing this information. "And what about her natural instincts, her need for space, territory, hunting opportunities? I've watched her track birds through my windows, stalk squirrels in the yard. My home, however comfortable we've made it, is still fundamentally a human environment." A thoughtful silence fell over the room. It was Diane who finally spoke. "Eleanor, it sounds like you have an alternative proposal in mind." "Not a proposal exactly," Eleanor replied. "More of a question. Is there a way we could create something better for Moxie than either extreme, neither confined to a standard sanctuary enclosure nor limited to a human home?" The discussion that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, with ideas flowing freely as the group worked to envision a new model for animals like Moxie, wild creatures whose circumstances had placed them in that ambiguous space between wild and domesticated. By the time they adjourned, the outline of a plan had emerged that felt right to Eleanor in a way that simple extension of the current arrangement never could have. 6 weeks later, on a clear morning in late October, Eleanor stood at the edge of a specially designed habitat at the far end of the Wildlife Center's property. The 5-acre enclosure, fenced to prevent escape but spacious enough to provide genuine freedom of movement, contained a carefully crafted mixture of natural landscape features: trees for climbing, undergrowth for stalking, open areas for sunning, along with a small, heated structure that resembled a miniature cabin. "What do you think, Moxie?" Eleanor asked softly. "Is this a suitable compromise?" The Bobcat, secure in her travel enclosure beside Eleanor, watched the new environment with obvious interest, her ears forward and alert. James stood nearby, accompanied by Dr. Diaz and 2 center staff members who would be primarily responsible for the habitat's maintenance. "Remember, Aunt Ellie, this isn't goodbye," James reminded her gently. "The cabin is yours to use whenever you want. We designed it specifically so you could spend time here with Moxie, even stay overnight if you wish." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite articulate. The cabin represented the physical manifestation of their compromise, a human space within Moxie's territory rather than the reverse. Here, Moxie could live with greater freedom, while Eleanor could maintain their special connection through regular visits. The arrangement also allowed for Moxie's continued participation in the Natural Home Security Initiative, with controlled transport to presentations balanced by extended periods in her natural habitat. "It's time," Eleanor said simply, kneeling beside the travel enclosure to open its door. Moxie hesitated briefly, her golden eyes meeting Eleanor's in a moment of connection that transcended species. Then, with characteristic grace, she stepped out of the enclosure and into her new territory. They watched as she moved cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence investigating her surroundings with the instinctive curiosity of her kind. When Moxie disappeared into a thicket of undergrowth, James placed a comforting hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "She'll be back," he assured her. "The cabin has your scent, and we've created paths she'll quickly recognize as leading to you." Eleanor smiled through tears. She made no effort to hide. "I know. She's not leaving me. She's just finding a better balance. As am I." In the months that followed, the Natural Home Security Initiative continued to evolve, expanding its reach beyond Pinecrest to communities throughout the state. Eleanor remained its human face, bringing her unique blend of grandmotherly wisdom and unexpected steel to presentations. Moxie participated regularly, transported from her habitat for carefully scheduled appearances, her composure during these events seeming to grow from the confidence she gained in her more natural living situation. Eleanor, too, found a new rhythm to her life. 3 days each week, she worked from the small office that had been established at the Wildlife Center, coordinating the initiative's growing activities. 2 nights each week, she stayed in the cabin within Moxie's habitat, often waking to find the Bobcat curled at the foot of her bed or watching from a nearby shelf, close enough for connection but free to come and go as she pleased. The irony wasn't lost on Eleanor that it had taken a break-in, a wild predator, and a near disaster to lead her to this unexpected fulfillment in her later years. One evening, as she sat on the cabin's small porch watching Moxie patrol the perimeter of her territory, Sandra Walton joined her for what had become a weekly ritual of shared tea and conversation. "I heard the governor's office called," Sandra mentioned. "They want to feature the initiative in a statewide public safety campaign." Eleanor nodded. "James is handling the details. I told him I'm happy to participate as long as it doesn't exploit Moxie or oversimplify what we've learned." Sandra smiled, observing how Moxie had paused in her rounds to watch a bird, her body perfectly still yet thrumming with potential energy. "You know, when I first suggested using Moxie as an educational ambassador, I never imagined it would go this far. I was just trying to save a bobcat and help a nice lady keep her unusual roommate. And instead, we created something that's helping hundreds of people protect their homes," Eleanor finished. "Though I maintain that the most important lesson wasn't about locks or lighting or landscape design." "What was it then?" Eleanor watched as Moxie abandoned her hunt to approach the porch, jumping gracefully onto the railing before settling into a comfortable position nearby. Close but not touching, connected but independent. "That security isn't just about keeping danger out," Eleanor said softly. "It's about creating spaces where we can all be true to our nature while still looking out for each other. Moxie taught me that, and Marcus Devlin too in his way." As darkness fell over the habitat, the unlikely companions, elderly woman and wild bobcat, sat in companionable silence, each in their rightful place yet bound by an understanding that had begun on a fateful night when a thief broke into a grandmother's house, never expecting to find a bobcat waiting inside.